Hello and welcome to the BYU Library Family History webinar. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Olivia Tuller and I'll be your host for this webinar. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You are welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments, insights, and questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar is on January 15th with Catherine Grant on Family Search Date and Place Standards, Basics and Beyond. If you would like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from James Tanner on using land surveys to find where your ancestor lived. Before we begin, here's a little bit about James. James Tanner has spent over 18 years as a family history volunteer and is presently serving at the BYU Library Family History Center. He is on the board of directors of the Family History Guide Association and has 7 children and 34 grandchildren. And we'll now turn the time over to James.
Okay, well, today we're going to be talking about using land and property records in your research. We have, this is particularly important from a genealogical research standpoint because we rely heavily on issues when we're doing initial research and basically startup, let's say, getting going on being a genealogist. We have a tendency to focus on what we call very easy records, the birth, marriage, and death, and census records. That doesn't mean they're any easier to use or work with or anything, but it's just they're the first ones that give substantial information about people. But as time goes, as research goes into the past, uh, pretty soon you're finding out that birth, marriage, and death records aren't so reliable because they aren't kept regularly. And from that point, then you learn that census records kind of disappear after a few years going back in time. And so when you're doing research, we need to look to records. And I would put land and property records as kind of the go-to place to start to get really good information, along with probate and other records that deal with property and deal with the people. So we're going to get into this and get started. A couple of quotes here I think are important to understand, and that is that a thorough understanding of the modern land law is impossible without a knowledge of its historical background. And this quote comes from Cornelius Monaghan. Uh, this is a book from West Publishing Company back in 1962, but it's never going to be out of date because it deals with history. But it's called Introduction to the Law of Real Property. This was my textbook for my property law classes at the university at ASU, at Arizona State University. And I became a primarily property-oriented attorney for many, many years. And that became one of my major areas of representation. So real property for me is what this says about it, historical background is definitely true. There's just, you'll just see that the jargon and I mean all the different language in there in all these different documents is basically difficult to deal with. And there's another one from Mr. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes that a page of history is worth a volume of logic. That means that, and what he's trying to say there is that if we don't know that you can be very logical in who's the connections you're working with in your family history research, but unless you know the history, you may be just clear out of the ballpark with regards to the accuracy of what you're dealing with. So let's move on here. So I'm going to kind of summarize that doing genealogical research without a knowledge of history is like wandering in a forest without a compass or a map. Um, it's, you really, once you've divorced yourself from history, if you don't know the history of what's going on, it's a lot of the things that you'll see in genealogy appear to be totally you know, unable to even identify what's going on because it's only the history that gives the context of the people and their lives. And this is particularly true uh, when we have monumentally large events such as the American Civil War or the World War I, World War II, and the other monumentally large ones. But smaller and localized things can also be something that is affects exactly what your understanding and research is. So understanding this, that real property deeds and other documents can contain valuable genealogical information. I have seen deeds that basically named every person in a family. And so I feel like these are the kinds of things that you can, that really give you uh, the background, let's call it the structure to your genealogical research. Once you know where these people lived and the properties they lived on and identify on a map, and then I mean, we're physically able to then go to the places where they came from in many parts of the world, but obviously that would not be true everywhere. But today, this is just where it gives you that type of information. Um, so the way that we do research, and today even more importantly than it has been in the past, is that we start with the locations. That's the number one focus point. We need to know that the locations are accurate, that that they're properly recorded, and that they are consistent. Uh, just today, this afternoon, I looked at a pedigree from one of the patrons at the BYU library, and the problem was that we had people in the 1700s who were being born in three different states in the before the United States, in the colonies. And the answer is in the early 1700s, there was no practical transportation other than ships and to travel from one state to another. It's not like today where you just get in a car and drive. It was it was very difficult. And so unless you focus on the locations, there was a whole line of the pedigree that went back in time, but was now kind of meaningless unless we could figure out if all these people really came from the same family or if um, that difference was because of their different locations. Land and property records can include this whole list of documents. Now, I sort of uh, thought about, well, should I put it into, making them appear one at a time? I really, in this particular case, I'm not I don't have time in an hour presentation to go through and have you understand each of these different uh, aspects of land and property. Many we have done entire presentations on Homestead and on boundary land warrants and on maps and plats and surveys. All of these things can go into being part of what we would consider to be land and property records, not just deeds, but there are all these other things that are incurred here. One good thing about the land and property that's happened in the last 8 to 10 years, I would guess, would be a good time frame, is that more and more of the counties across the United States are are opening up their property records to essentially the world and in digital format. So it's places where you can start to look. And I'll talk about this in just a while, but this kind of thing. So these names, this list of names, deeds, grantee index, grantor index, and so forth, are all types of land and property records that can be very, very helpful in providing crucial information for identifying people. Many times while we're doing research, we get to the point where we're thinking that there are no more records to become available. Well, deeds are probably one of the most important of these documents that we look here to, and the most, let's say, not easy, but the most available. And so when you get to that point, you may find out a lot more information and be able to confirm information that you may have already found in the past. So so I guess to summarize this is kind of an example for what just happened recently with Family Search. Family Search has been working on, as have all the people out there, all interested people have been working on handwriting recognition for years. So eventually, and it's been about 50 years in the development, and in the last 2 or 3 years or more, it has matured. And handwriting recognition is now much more accurate by the computer than it could be by even any human person. And the speed, of course, is phenomenally faster than any human person. And presently, Family Search has turned their land and property records towards handwriting recognition and have put up huge databases of millions and millions of records that are searchable word for word. So in this particular case, I began that when I realized what was there. It's on the familysearch.org/labs, LABS, labs website. And on that website, I did a search for one of my great-grandfather who has tremendous amount of information about this person, and immediately found a series of deeds and other types of legal documents that I am certain no one has ever seen. And the reason was because he's not one of the major people in that document. He's not named as the grantor grantee, as you see from the grantor index. He is basically he's just named in the deed with a lot of other people. And so those are things that we can certainly where we can begin to see the power of these documents when it's coupled with the increase in technology. So I guess the challenge here is that to learn to use land records, and property records, you need to learn all the terms and all this. It may turn like happened at the first few days of my law school experience, is the students spend as much time in the library looking up all the terms that the professors were using than they did anything else because they had to learn the language. And that's basically what we need to do as genealogists. And okay, so let's kind of give an idea of why we would put put these land and property records into such a prominent part of our research. And that is because the history of the United States is based on the history of land development. We often hear the stories about the immigrants coming to America and all of the problems and all of the challenges of the immigrants and how they came here to go to a free country. Um, the initial way that the country was settled was through land development and land sales. So these different grants, the Massachusetts Bay Colony Grant and the Plymouth Council Grant and the Virginia grants and all the other grants down the eastern coast of the United States today, were done for the purpose of selling land to people in England. So the incentive the people had to come to America was they were able to purchase land and live on the land that they owned, um, at a relatively reasonable price for that time. So these are all the history of the country is wrapped up in these land and property uh, up things, well, the land and property businesses that were going on at the time from the very earliest pilgrims. You get to the pilgrims, the pilgrims came on the Mayflower, and about little less than half of the people the boat with the pilgrims were coming here for land and had nothing to do with the pilgrims' religion. So this is the kind of thing that, understanding this, we begin to realize that in order for us to locate and talk about and work with our ancestors as we go back in time, it all depends on where they were and what kind of properties they owned. And so this is kind of the most important things. Now, technically, this is getting into a little bit of technical stuff because this technical stuff is important in understanding how, what the language, in a sense, that the people, when you're talking about land and property, where all these terms come from and how it all works. And with for my education as a lawyer, I was required to take periodic education every year, continuing education. And part of that for me was going and actually listening to surveyors and other property people come and talk about what was going on with the land and property issues back then, and when I was being an active attorney. But there, in the United States, as it evolved, there are two main systems for describing and identifying the land. The one system, of course, is in the eastern part of the United States, and it's called the state land system. The reason is that it was developed early on by the first original settlers, and it was kind of an echo from England and the other European countries as how the land was being owned and distributed. The second big division is over here, and it's the rest of the United States. So you think of the colonies in the former colonies as the state land system, and the rest of the country with the bright colored different areas there on the map as the public land survey system. Each one of those colors indicates a different started survey. In other words, a survey started where the little line crosses come in. If you look at states like Arizona and New Mexico, you'll see there's a line north and south and a line east and west, and that where that crosses there is the 0 point for the public land survey system. In Arizona, you can see in the upper tiny little bit of land up in northern eastern Arizona that had a different land survey system, and we happen to own land in that property area, and it was a challenge because the two systems crashed into each other. So it's an interesting thing when you get into it. The state land system is what people refer to as meets and bounds. So your meets are the measurements that so many poles or so many feet or so many whatever uh, going around the property. And the bounds are the edges of the property. In other words, who owns the property to each of the other. Where are you divided off on a meets and bounds from the neighboring property? So here we have Richard Lee in the middle, and you can see that there's Thomas McGuire and there's a Robert Gillian, and there's some other people that aren't necessarily identified on this particular drawing. So this is the state land system, and it's fairly complicated. And when you look at a deed for a state land property, it'll say something like beginning at the corner of the marked corner next to the barn, 50 feet to the west, 20 feet to the north, etc. And by the large tree and fences. So all of those kind of physical things were being used for the surveys. Now, today, fast forward to, 200, 300 years later, basically the meets and bounds have all been surveyed and recorded, and so there isn't any question about the markers. So the markers aren't as important as they were back then. No longer do we have to see if we can find the oak tree or any of the other things that were used as markers. Now the public land survey is more regular. It kind of ignores the ground and creates a grid that is imposed on the property. And the descriptions you'll see are like the one at the bottom of this this picture, and that is a parcel would be like the northeast quarter of the northwest quarter of section 14, township 2 south, range 3 west, and that would put it in that square on the map, the cross line map at the top. And then you would have the townships, and then each of the townships would have a section number, and those section numbers would then be further divided up if the land was sold further in by the same type of language. Now, what's been confusing sometimes, obviously, is that eventually some of the aspects of the meets and bounds type of surveys end up showing up in the public land survey system. So you may have a little bit of gerrymandering in there to get the lines, because not all the property lines are straight and easily determined. So this is an important point to understand, that these things are so regular and so predictable and so able to be useful, is that when you determine one of these descriptions, a deed, for example, you find a deed from your ancestor, you can actually go to this type of program here, and this is one example. It's called EarthPoint, and EarthPoint, and you can then put in the description of the property from the place. Obviously, you need to know the state and which state it was in, and the name of the survey. But then these programs will then create a file that shows the exact location of the property on a Google Earth map. So you can see where the lines are, and you can see where it goes across a road or across through the middle of a reservoir or a lake or whatever. And so this is the kind of thing that helpful. So when I was doing research initially on my great grandfather, I could go I didn't have to go search through the documents, but I did have to have a deed. So I did have some deeds, so I used those and could find exactly where his property was on the map and see it. And if I had been so inclined, I could have traveled up there and driven right to the property and had a look at the property. Um, let's just say from the standpoint of my great grandfather who lived in northern Arizona that there was nothing particularly, um, let's call it impressive or different about the property and it from all the other properties in northern Arizona. So it wasn't any, there's no particular reason to do that, except from the standpoint of doing research, you can tell that this might have a tremendous impact on your research because as you define exactly where the property was, you can also define who the neighbors were. And if you're having trouble finding information about that person, once you have that deed and that description, you may be able to find the information you need from his or her neighbors. So here's the link to EarthPoint. You just look it up on EarthPoint, tools for Google Earth. Okay, one of the really important things about land and property is that you can track the movements of the ancestors' relatives. I mentioned earlier about looking at a pedigree today where there were people who were born in New York or married in uh, New York and then had moved to Virginia and then North Carolina and South Carolina. And the answer is not very likely in the 1700s. But if we were to try to do, if I were in the position of doing the research in that circumstance, I would begin with the most recent ancestor, and I would start looking for any of the property that they owned and any of the probates that have been created as they died, the probate records for their death. And I would see who got the property and where it was and when it was sold. And so those kinds of things can give you an idea. So if I were, for instance, in that hypothetical New York to the South movement, if I did find land sold in New York and I found the same person buying property in Virginia, that would explain the movement, regardless of the issue of the years or when it occurred. But then again, in those situations, you're almost skeptical to the point of trying to make sure that you're not just matching up a name with two people with the same name in both of those places. So this is the way to untangle all that. The untangling comes from knowing exactly where these people lived, and that gives you access to a lot more records because of the general rule that genealogical records are kept at or near the location of the event that occurred. So this is basically the opening up of the doors to understanding all of that and getting those people's movements across. And this is what's called a cadastral map. And the word cadastral is is kind of a jargon term. But what it means is that it records the ownership of the property and sometimes a lot more information. And the reason why it records that information is usually for the purposes of tax assessments. So the reason why they're showing the property is because they were assessing taxes based on the size of the property. So all of these properties, the acreage of these properties needed to be identified, and then they would be paying a proportionate share. And or it might be determined on the sales price or the value of the land, in which case that value is set sort of based on sales. There are, across the United States, there are cadastral maps all over. You may never have heard of them. You may never have seen one. You may never have even heard of a reference to one in the context of genealogy, but they are very valuable and they're very pervasively used across the country. You think in terms, if you think in terms of real estate tax, there's no place in the United States where there isn't a real estate tax, and so there is no place in the country where there's not a map showing the properties that are being taxed. So that's the kind of the rule. And historically, that's been the case all across the country. And that means these are valuable records from historical and genealogical standpoints because they involve families and names and people. So really this map is what it is it's the extent, the value, and the ownership of the land. And it's usually, as I mentioned, for taxation. Oh, there we go. This is just a detail. I thought it'd be interesting to see sometimes what they look like. And each one of those little squares is a dwelling and for a farm. And in this case, the this old map, it shows the owners of the map. And it's helpful, once again, as I mentioned, that you can, because if you find your ancestor on a map like this, then you automatically have a lot more research you could do into the neighbors and surrounding people because they may be relatives. It's very, 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 very common that people lived in older time and before times in close proximity to their neighbors, to their relatives as neighbors. So this is this is a way to begin getting into the research for this whole area here in this particular part of Pennsylvania. Wrong direction. There we go. Just as a matter of interest, going up Rock Canyon here in Provo, Utah, I found a cadastral survey marker from the National Forest Service. This is very, these are all over the country. And so they're available and recorded. And where are these maps? Once again, we're going to go to the basis for this, and that is that they're in the counties of the various counties of the country. So all of these maps and records are found in the individual counties. Are they online in Family Search and our Ancestry and all the other big websites? The answer is some of them are and some of them aren't. And some of these, as currently, are not available except in the paper view from in paper in the actual office of the recorder in these counties across the nation. But over the past few years, there's been a constant effort to digitize all the records and then make them available online. In some places, it's more difficult to get access online, and it's because of just back and forth and the bureaucracies and paying for copies and things like that. But by and large, you can go to many of the counties in the United States directly and look for their land and property records in their county recorder's office, usually is where they're kept, or in the court, and they may have it all online with all of the lists of all the deeds and all of the times and the changes in of the property. One key to getting into this is that some of the U.S. federal census records tell you if your ancestors owned or rented the property, and that's important. One thing that you do get from a census, whether or not your they owned or rented the property, is that the census records will tell you where they were physically because they were counted. And in later records after 1850, uh, they generally you can figure out exactly where they lived in the town from the census maps that were created. So there's all this tied to property is the census record. Underlying the census record is the information about where the people lived and their identity of their home and their farms. And in some of the years of the census, it also gives a value of the real estate property. So you can have kind of a determination of what the economic standing of your ancestors were. So in some cases, and originally in all of the area that is the the state surveys are are the lands were subject in different parts of the country to uh, homesteading early on, and I'll talk in a minute about that. Also, there's called uh, the bounty land bounty records. But this is an example of a 160-acre transfer to this is on a for service a bounty land serve office. So it's possible that something like this could be the origin of your um, person's land. And now, if you know of his land and you've identified your ancestor, then this tells you where he fought in the war. And so this is more opens up more to the military records and gives people the opportunity to, to do the research back even further on military records and the land and property records and many other records. And also, if the person owned the land, it's almost it was, I can say, close to 100% inevitable that as they died, the land had to be probated. That's back years ago, not most currently. So we have other ways of transferring land since around the 1940s. But before that, there is it's always almost 100% that whoever owned the land when they died had to go through probate. So there's even going to be more information generated from the land by the probate action. So this is kind of one way of obtaining the lands. The Homestead Act was a different way. The bounty lands were given to military people, but the homestead land patents were done for by uh, they were actually a sale of land for a certain low, sort of low price, and then they paid that like a few dollars an acre for their land. But then there was different rules and regulations about how they went about obtaining what was called the patent to the land, which is the proof that the person had complied with the requirements of ownership and was given title, free title to, title that was free of any encumbrances to from the government. And the reason why I'm kind of going back and forth on this is because the Homestead Act changed like 10 times between 1862 and the last sales that were made up in Alaska in the 1900s. So it's, it's just basically something that you have to dig into, but there are programs out there that list all these patents. And so you can get out there and determine exactly where the property was on a map and see the land from simply by the fact that there is a land patent. And you have the description of the property as it appears here on this deed to my great grandfather. The north half of the section 12 in township 18 north of range 18 east of the Gila Salt River Meridian, Arizona, containing 320 acres. So this is the kind of thing that will help us to identify more information. All of this information about the patents is kept in the uh, General Land Office, the GLO, as it's called. And you just can do a search here for the survey to whether if you think your ancestor was the first landowner and may have gotten the property through Homestead, then you could basically get into these records by looking for his or her name and doing a search here on the GLO record office. It's glo.gov is the address here, but and many times, well, let me just kind of explain why that happens. Uh, Giving a lot of URLs to look at on a video, to me, it seems a little bit distracting. But the question here is all you need to look for is the Bureau of Land Management General Land Office record, and it'll bring you right up to the website. So these are more found more easily through search terms than they are through trying to copy uh, the internet addresses. Jumping back to bounding warrants, warrants were given to eligible veterans, granting them rights to free land on the public domain. And those records were issued only between 1789 and 1833, and then to veterans of the War of 1812 between 1815 and 1858. So these are old documents, but interestingly, a few years ago, someone called me up and asked a question. They said, we're buying some property here in Utah, and the document says that it was done with a patent, and we don't understand that. And we got into that discussion and looked at the documents, and it turned out that this patent to the land in Davis County, Utah, had been issued back in the 1800s, but it had never been exercised. In other words, no one ever, once they had the patent, they never did anything with the land. And so and it never got sold. And so it was passed down and passed down through the transfer of the probates. But at the core bottom of it, it was actually a piece of patent property into the probably into the 2000s since the turn of the century. And it was still the basic property for conveying ownership of the land. So it's these documents will show up if there is uh, a survey or a title search made that gets this property that identifies this property. So what I'm referring to there is called the chain of title. The chain of title is the ownership of a piece of property. You can use that to reconstruct multiple generations of ancestors. Um, if you're going through if you find some original property, or even you find a current property, you can, if you learned who sold the property, where they got the property, if it came through a probate or if it came from a relative, a parent, then you are back another generation. And then if you look for the property back further, you may be able to trace this back to the original settler in whatever place that the property occurs. Now, what I have showing here is a parcel map for Utah County in Utah. This is not unique. It was the same thing in many states, and many counties have maps that are similar to this. But what happens with this map is that you can go in and find the parcels of the piece of property, any of those houses that are in there, or the buildings or whatever. And then it will show you the boundaries of the property, and then it will go on giving you the the whole title, chain of title of the property. So it's just one lookup and you have the chain of title. If you're interested and you lived in Arizona or Utah or some of the states that have this, you can go into the county, wherever the county is, and get your map. And the larger counties would be the ones that would have maps like this, and some of the outlying counties not with smaller populations may never have implemented it, so it may not be available. But it's generally turns out to be something that gets happening on a statewide basis, and pretty soon a whole state has this. And I know that in Arizona, we could look on a map for almost any place in the state to see the chain of title. So here exactly is an abstract. This would be a summary, I guess would be a good word to use instead of abstract, but it's a selection of information about the ownership of a particular piece of property. So you see that the property address was 751 South, 170 East in Provo. And going down on this, you have the grantor, the person who sold the property, and the grantee, the person who bought the property. And so you have Union Pacific Railroad Company selling the property to Utah Transit Authority. And basically down at a certain point, then it gets sold down to Norvest LC, and then DR Norton, home builder, and then back to Norvest NC. And there could be more information about this. There could be additional, there's a link here for more. So there might be more additional information. So this last person who purchased in 2009 could possibly have been the person who got the property, who has the property. We don't know whether this one goes backwards, because what this does is it says that the most current sale was that went in was in 2014. So it's maybe that this was a movement where there was some property that was owned and then had to be conveyed to the Utah Transit Authority. Okay, so that's how this goes. But in each case, there's a sale or transfer of the property, some property interest with each of these documents. Oh, sorry. So most of these documents you're going to find in county assessor offices, recorder's offices, and treasurer offices. The treasurer's office are going to have tax records, which are even more useful in some instances, because the tax records are going to show the property as it is, as the valuation of the property. And so it will also show the ownership of the property. And the recorder's office is where, in order to transfer, and most of the United States, the transfer of property, real property, that meaning property, land and houses and things like that, the real property transfers have to be recorded. In other words, if you sold somebody your, whatever, your motorbike or something, unless it was registered with the government, you wouldn't have to transfer the ownership of it. Any kind of thing. If you had a garage sale and you sold a bunch of stuff, nobody's going to care where it came from and what it sold for. But the county assessors, recorders, and treasurers all are worried about that, because they're going to be assessing taxes on that property. And so they want to know who the owner is. They want to know what the description of the property is, what's on the property, and then they want to know how much it's worth, so they can set their tax rate. So because of their interest in collecting taxes, then we have a great amount of information about property. Now this map is another one. This is a map from the Arizona uh, program that shows the ownership and identity of each of the parcels. So zooming in on this map will show you who owns each of the parcels in this map, and then gives you a key to, if you know the owner currently, you can go find in the recorder's office, you can find the any of the other properties purchased, and you can also get the chain of title in some instances. So here, I have a problem here. We do the chain of title is the ownership of the property. That's what we had earlier. So that this all is online now. Okay, so land records are even in the National Archives. There's homestead and land entries. There's other things. I would certainly recommend searching at other places in the on the internet for the fact that these documents may be available before attempting to get some information out of the National Archives, which is quite complicated at sometimes. The state archives, historical sites, museums, and libraries may have the copies of the documents. If a county was split, sometimes the documents would end up at the state rather than in the county. And so it's sometimes takes a little research to figure out who's actually holding those particular records. When we're talking about the records in the counties, my experience, I think one of the most telling experiences was in the Hancock County Recorder's Office in Illinois, and going into their room that was about 15 feet high with shelves with these giant books of all the land records. So in addition to that, there are title companies and abstractors. There's always this idea that one of the ideas is that there were burned counties. That means the courthouse burned down, all the records were lost. The land records generally were being kept separately by abstractors and other companies and other interested individuals, and they're almost always reconstructed, especially if the county wants to continue to levy taxes. Obviously, the large online websites have gotten some records, and some of the records are available in book form and in digital form, and some of the books are even digitized. So there is, you can even begin your research on one of the, or all of these websites for additional information. For some information about how the records were kept and where they are, and all the types of records that might be available, the Family Search Research Wiki is a tremendous assistance. It's got all of the details on all of the different types of things and explains it in detail. The Family History Guide also has an extensive amount of information about property, land, and probate records and wills in every state and every county and in the United States, and in counties in England and many of the other countries of the world. And we have, as you probably know, the BYU Library Family History Center's YouTube channel, where we now have over 1,000 videos on all sorts of subjects. Okay, well, thanks for watching. Do I have any questions?
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We hope you will join us for our next webinar, which is on January 15th with Catherine Grant on Family Search Date and Place Standards, Basics and Beyond. A recording of this webinar will be made available next week. You can view that on our YouTube channel or on our website. If you have any comments or questions, you can always email us at fh_webinars@byu.edu or follow Facebook and Twitter. Thank you and have a wonderful week.